yeah, please talk about these pageants, these cycles, what they were, and the context in
So
which we have these plays in a collection such as
yeah,
this.
that'd be great. So as you say, like there were these different sorts of liturgical plays that were then beginning to break out into more dramatic space, more elaborate tales of Bible stories. The real kickoff, most um, Colley's wonderful. There's been a lot of huge work since that book, largely by, frankly, the Marxist new historians, who've done an amazing amount of work on how these plays took place, the social context in which they took place. And a great kickoff, you might say, is 1264, when Urban IV institutes the Feast of Corpus Christi, right? Largely under Aquinas's influence and the miracle of Bolsena, right? And then there becomes this real dedication to the Feast of Corpus Christi, right? And we work towards a date for the Feast of Corpus Christi, which has stayed pretty much the same ever since, right? It's after Trinity Sunday, so right after we have Pentecost, then we have Trinity Sunday, and then we have the Feast of Corpus Christi, which again moved around a little bit in the Middle Ages, but largely then. And I want you to think about when that is in a northern latitude like England. This is an agrarian society. The crops are in the ground. Days are long. Right? They're really long. I was in Ireland once in the summer, and I love showing a photograph to people, and I say, "What time do you think this is?" And they guess about 7:15 in the evening. It's 10:30 at night.
Yes, I had the same experience. I was in the UK last summer, and in Scotland, sunset was after 10 p.m. Yeah,
Yeah,
in
and
June.
so there's this wonderful time where the community can come together. There's not a lot of daily work to do in the agriculture community, and we can come together. And so what we think is sort of between both these kind of you might say secular human needs and the church plopping a feast day right in front of them, this develops these huge festivals and these huge festivals of plays that happen in this time, and they seem to locate around this Feast of Corpus Christi. And what's fascinating is how much we know about how they actually took place. Right, the late Middle Ages were really the birth of a sort of bureaucratic record keeping, and they're often called the mystery plays, not because they stage mysterious things happening, but because they were put on by the guilds, as you mentioned, right, and the guilds. When you were instituted into a guild, right, it was said that you were learning the mysteries of blacksmithing, woodworking, cobblering or whatever. And so the
Interesting.
guilds themselves became known as the mysteries. And so these plays are often called the mystery plays for that very reason. And here's the fascinating thing. Like, we have actual records over decades of a particular guild putting on one of these plays over and over again. We know what they spent on costumes. We know what they spent on props and materials. Like, over a certain amount of time, we have records of the city fining a particular guild, saying, "Well, you didn't do this very well last year. We're taking that play away from you," which caused a lot of. And this is the amazing thing that these new historicists have come up with. And so we know that this is a huge civic festival mapped over a religious festival. And this is where I'm saying, in some ways, that secular and the religious come back together in these festivals. We know the path. So these were all performed on carts. That we can see two different ways they were performed. One is that the carts wove their way through town. We know the actual path they took through the town of York in that cycle of plays. And they would stop at various times and perform these plays. Or we have some evidence that the carts would be positioned, say, all around the town square, and the people would move to the various carts while they were all performing them. But either way, there's these little playlets called pageants that are put on, and they cover all of sacred time, all of sacred history. They start with the creation, and there's a little playlet on the creation. There's a little playlet on the creation of Adam and Eve. There's a little playlet on the fall. There's a little playlet on Cain and Abel, and they go all the way through biblical history, all the way, right, to the end of time, to the second coming, right,
Mm.
and so this is a way, of course, of teaching the people the stories of the Bible. I love these sort of ideas that no one in the Middle Ages knew the Bible, or the Bibles were chained up to keep away from people. Well, for one thing, they were chained up because they were enormously expensive things, right? You don't want to put a $4 million object just sitting around in the church for anyone to walk off with it.
Mhm.
But people knew an enormous amount of the Bible. There's a scholar who went and studied, but this is how they knew the Bible. They knew it through carols, through plays, through music, and these performances took you from the beginning of sacred time and walked you all the way through the Bible to the book of Revelation. And there were these little playlets. Now, they're put on by the guilds, so they're put on by townspeople, probably written by a cleric in town, right? Because there's an enormous amount of sophisticated theological stuff going on in these plays.
Right.
But they're performed by your fellow townspeople. And I love that thought of, who plays God? You know, which guild gets to do the creation? Well, probably like the carpenters, and I can't remember, but we have record of those guys. Who gets to do Adam and Eve? Noah Noah, right, has a play that became very famous for Noah's wife being this kind of cantankerous, shrewish woman who refused to get on the ark. She's like, oh, it stinks in there. It's smelly. I'm not doing this sort of thing. And often there were kind of fisticuffs between Noah and his wife. She became a famous image that Shakespeare picks up on in The Taming of the Shrew.
Wow.
She becomes the shrew figure
Right.
in the Middle
And
Ages.
this was put on by the shipwrights, perhaps. Right.
These guys all put on these plays, right? And
Yeah.
so what you're seeing are your fellow townspeople, right? In these cities that are not very big. York is what, 10,000 people, I think, at this time,
Yeah.
and it's the second largest city in England. So you're seeing your friends up there. You're seeing probably the young, beautiful 14-year-old girl playing the Virgin Mary. You're seeing, a friend of yours playing God and playing the devil. And what this is going to lead into is a great deal of playing to the audience, a great deal of physical comedy and physical humor. And so
Right.
these plays have this fascinating mixture of very serious subject matter and then also a heck of a lot of fun and goofiness, quite frankly, where
Right,
you're
because
playing to the
they
audience.
do read like something like a community theater kind of thing,
Absolutely.
and that's not to say that there's nothing sophisticated in them. And in particular, the verse, pretty much across the board, I was pretty impressed with the verse. These are verse plays, we should
Hmm.
mention that, I guess. Um, but yeah, there is this kind of, yeah, this winking to the audience and things like that happen.
Oh, sure. In the Second Shepherd's play, which, if you're an English major, might be the one because it was the one that got kind of stuck into the Norton anthology for many years. There's there's a lot of funny things we could come back to, but at the end, you throw kind of the villain of the play in a blanket, and you probably got the audience to help out with that, right? And you get down, and there's kind of audience participation in a great number of these plays.
Right.
And you can imagine them kind of booing and hissing, the devil and the evil characters and cheering on the good characters.
Right. Right.
But I think another thing that's so fascinating about these plays is there's a great deal of anachronism in them. And so, and you read in, say, the Abraham and Isaac play, well, and Abraham keeps mentioning the Trinity. And it keeps talking about praying to the Trinity, right? And
Right.
you think like, what's, these are just sort of silly medieval people. They made a mistake. They didn't have a sense of historical time schemes or periods that we gain in the Renaissance. No, I don't think that's what it is. Actually, I think what you'll find in so many of those places is what they're playing with is typology. And the Abraham and Isaac play, right, is teaching, right, these villagers in York or Coventry the very notion of the typology of Abraham and Isaac as a type of the crucifixion. And the scenes are just incredibly moving and poignant, right? As Isaac appeals to his father and says, there are things like Abraham saying to Isaac, Isaac, sweet son, peace, peace, for thou breakest my heart on three. With a Trinitarian reference there, right? Isaac says, Father, since it may be no otherwise, let it pass over as well as I. The image of Isaac as Christ and instituting a new Passover. I mean, that's really subtle stuff that's being taught to illiterate, carpenters and wheelwrights and cobblers in the town of York.
Right.
Real and powerfully moving moments, right? Where the Isaac eventually says, "Oh, Father of heaven, to thee I cry, Lord, receive me into thy hand."
Hmm. Yeah.
It's really fascinating and moving stuff where
Right.
the author of these texts keeps using this notion of anachronism as a way to introduce typology, it seems to
Right.
me.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about here. Now, my experience reading the plays, and I didn't have the time to reread most of them, so it was just reading my first impressions and getting used to the language and stuff. I wouldn't say that I was greatly moved on a religious level by many of them. Some of them I was, like the that moment with Isaac that you mentioned, and particularly the way that there's a sort of psychological realism to it, because you have Isaac begging Abraham for his life, and then he submits when he learns that it's God's will that he be sacrificed. But then after everything was resolved, and God stops Abraham from sacrificing his son, and they get the ram, and Isaac is still a little bit shaken up, and he's still a bit scared, and he says he never wants to come to that hill again. So there's a bit of realism, because, when I read that story, of course, I always wonder, well, what was it like for Isaac after going through that experience? And there's a little bit of a nod to that, which I liked. The scene of the woman caught in adultery is quite dramatic. The lamentation of the women on their way to the tomb in the resurrection play is quite moving. The crucifixion is quite moving. The way that the whole thing is about the workmanship of the soldiers crucifying Jesus, and it's just this long belabored process of, no, nail the hole there, not there, and kind of like the realism of the perspective of these people who are just doing a bit of work in nailing this man to a cross, and the sort of brutality of it is really emphasized.
That one's really fascinating. It was my friend Stefan Novinsky who, gosh, about 8 or 9 years ago, actually put on a good number of these plays here at the university. It was a 3.5 hour production. He says he'll never do it again. But it was really moving. And I will say, a lot of these, I think, they don't read as well on the page as, say, a Shakespeare play. Sometimes they can come across as a little bit flat. But in performance, Stefan says that this is theology in 4 dimensions. Right, is that we add time and movement to them. That one in particular is so fascinating because, yes, on the page, it's like, oh, we're going to approach the crucifixion from the point of view of these guys building the cross, and they actually, stretch Christ, like, oh, we put the hole in the wrong place, like, so we'll stretch him a little bit here, right? But Stefan taught me that if this is up on like a wheeled platform above the audience, right, who are down on the ground, what's happening here is the cross is flat on the platform. What you're seeing are these guys drinking, cursing, complaining, like, oh, what a day we're having, what everything, right? And then at the end, what happens is you raise Christ up. And it's only at the end of, listen to these ordinary guys complaining about their day and right? And in fact, sort of enacting the kind of selfishness, the ordinary selfishness of day-to-day sin of 14th, 15th century carpenters, right? And that then we raise Christ up and we're like, oh my gosh, like this is what we're talking about, right? This is what Christ's sacrifice is about, is not about, something fancy. It's about ordinary guys complaining and cursing and having to fight through just a tough day. And oh goodness, right? And that's where these plays, I think, really come alive. And that's really, it is, I admit, it's hard to see just on the page.
Right.
But when you see them performed is really something.